Hey everyone, welcome to the stream, the second part of the reviews of UX project reviews on the Eevee challenge. If you can hear me, if you can see me, please leave a message in the chat so I know that it's coming through, just to avoid the technical issues which come out way too late. And I can see a lot of people are in the chat and saying that I'm echoing. That's odd. Can you hear? Is it better now? Is it at least a little bit better? Echoing, but you can see me. Okay, you can see me and hear me, I guess. Is everyone else can hear me and see me fine? Let me know if it's coming through. Sounds okay. Okay, so maybe, and just maybe Brittany, maybe it's a phone or a headphone issue. Check it out. But hey everyone, hey Sarita, Brittany, Nicholas, Mohammed, Saeed, Vladimir, David, and many others. Thanks so much for joining, because it's a weekend. And hey, Kevin, as well. It takes a bit of encouragement to tune into these things on a weekend in particular. But happy weekend, happy Saturday. This is again a second part of the reviews of the UX project reviews, and you can already see on my screen what I'm sharing. One of them. But just to recap really quickly, let me pull it up in a different view. This is the Eevee adoption challenge, because as you know, in UK by 2030, no new vehicles which are petrol or diesel fueled are going to be produced or released or imported, meaning UK government wants to incentivize and double down on sustainability goals, and just generally, flip that green switch on a lot of different infrastructure developments, technology developments. And one of the ways is really legislative to drive that change, say to all the entrepreneurs and businesses, hey, we want to do this. What can you do for us? What sort of customer experiences could you shape? What sort of product or services could be released to empower this and just kind of, be part of that green movement ultimately. And you as a UX designers, as service designers, product designers, however you want to skin it, generally researchers and designers can take that and use that as a real lifelike case, I guess, or challenge or problem area, because this is upcoming. So having that type of case study can aid your portfolios and make it much more stronger and also lifelike, because you could come up with or pick up a challenge which is something quite ridiculous or something quite unrealistic. This is it. This is one of those challenges which is, you can just make it as real and lifelike as possible. And it's almost like when a lot of people or entry-level designers come to me and say, well, how do I get the experience without actually having a job or a professional experience? This is it. This is exactly how, because a lot of designers are gonna clock in those hours having professional work. Obviously, they're not might even do a proper UX, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you arrive at that. If you have a case study and if you spent enough hours actually applying UX steps, activities, processes, trying to again research and design, you're going to arrive at the evidence needed to get the job. And this is exactly, one of those opportunities to get it. Anyhow, I don't want to waffle too much. You know the drill. You probably have seen quite a few videos on this. I want to jump straight into the case studies. And we have 3 cases today. And let me see if I can pull up a different screen. If you can see this is a research project. And let me give a few notes about it, a few context notes. This project was done by Zoe. And Zoe decided to commit for 3 weeks worth of research project. She didn't want to think about app or website design. She kind of had that holistic mindset and approach, just going out there, researching, finding out all the different, I guess, issues or challenges people face, looking at different research which has already been done for her, and then seeing exactly where the opportunities for new ways is. And so she went just doing a research case, which I went through this, and it took me almost like it was a good read. It's written in an article format, but sort of like a pseudo case study. And just to give you an overview of that, this is about the Polish electric vehicle market and its developments by 2025. And what she's saying, she basically used my challenge as an inspiration, but went into it and actually tried to understand what is there in Poland happening. And I think it's a prime example of a market where EVs are booming. As you can see, this chart on a very high level immediately sums up to you that in the last, let's say, 4 years, it doubled, went almost 10x. And like the most latest fact is that there is 40,000 of electric vehicles in Poland right now registered. Now, Poland has a lot of, I guess, support for this, just like in UK. I don't know who inspires this or how does it start, but it starts with one governing body rolling out some support, like a scaffold for, experience to happen and incentivize the customers or the users to actually opt in and go for it. And she summarizes that with exactly what does it mean. And as you can see, if a vehicle is, let's say, less than 225,000 of Polish PLN. I'm not really sure what it stands for, but ultimately let's imagine it's euros for the sake of it. Anyhow, but it's for a personal people, for a personal, like a person, private citizen, I guess, you have different measures than the businesses. So she went and explored exactly which of those means what. Ultimately, what she wrote down as one of those findings, or I guess a summary synthesized outcome of that, is that a lot of people don't really know about this scheme, or they don't feel the necessity of applying for this scheme. And immediately here, what I had in mind was that, well, why don't we know about this scheme? Why don't we feel the necessity? That to me would be that next level to go deeper and understand immediate, I guess, behavioral drivers for each person. And someone corrected me, Polish zlot. I sort of have the feeling that it was lost, but PLN just threw me off as a shortening. But thanks so much, Shine, for chipping in the chat. Anyhow, so she wanted to validate those statements. And I like that we get back to the same theme we had yesterday reviewing the case studies, because the range anxiety and charging time is one of those key factors which comes into this. Also, lack of access to charging stations. But I will almost argue that range anxiety fuels that lack of access to ranging stations, or vice versa. It's almost like one feeds into the other one. And then subsidy application processing time, which I feel like you as a customer or a consumer would find out a bit later down the road. Therefore, it still to me feels like range anxiety is that key, or one of the key behavioral factors why people I guess what would prevent a regular citizen or every other person from opting in for EVs if there would be, let's say, a massive shift in services or products. And of course, she summarizes that a lot of at different bits, and then goes to explain each and every one case and almost like gives a case study for each of those statements, which is great. I think another thing is that she mentions different reports, but also references that in the research. And that's exactly how I would want a research to look like, where you actually back up and add context, add almost evidence for each statement. So it's not just, like a own summary or own opinion. It's actually shown case. And another thing, which is a general small, nitty gritty thing to pull out and show and kind of walk through is images, because a lot of case studies a lot of people in their case studies either choose to go very heavy in text or they go very heavy in imagery. I feel like this is a good balance, because you again want to use your images and content to back up your claims or add a bit, enrich it. Again, every image adds that story of 1,000 words, and I don't even need to read about this, just reading the headline and the actual image, I can get the point of what's being told here, because if you are a regular citizen in that area, you have only maybe 3 places to charge, which again fuels that anxiety of the proximity, the charge, and things of that nature. And I see the comment from Luisa. Hey, Luisa, I would like to see more of a source of energy, because what's the point of EV adoption if electricity still comes from burned fossil fuels? Precisely. This is actually one of the cases. If you didn't see my previous stream from yesterday, the last case study was exactly about that, where I think Gustavo was challenging this challenge, and he went cycling route, or went about looking at infrastructure and I guess even greener ways to do that. Again, I feel like this is one of the methods which might just, target the symptom, just like I think you would, or a lot of other people feel. But again, it's we need to pick our challenges, or where do we actually place, in which basket do we place our eggs and what do we focus on. But I do agree. It's targeting one of the symptoms or one of the touch points down the road instead of the root problem. But then knowing how big of a change and challenge it is, you kind of need to start with smaller steps. And EVs are emerging tech, and it drives a lot of those buzzwords and innovations, and a lot of, I guess, it's going to have a landslide of kind of behavioral change, and a lot of people are keen to get it done. Therefore, it's, one of the things we could look into, basically. But yeah, I'm totally with you on your comment. Anyhow, going back to this range anxiety, which is the most important bit, I feel like, she covers basically giving a few different bits. And I think this is Poland specific, right? But let's see, 67% don't give up the trips due to the limited range, long car charging time, electricity. But these are, I guess, attitudes and behaviors based on the existing EV users. I would be wondering, how does that bridge the gap between the potential ones, or people who are just, I guess, on the fence of going into the EV and using the EV. That to me would be one of the interesting links. I guess this is just a learning from people who are already using the electric vehicles. Then she goes to explain about charging time, and goes deep into that people prefer to charge at home, where explaining exactly about the parking areas. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, because I feel like, again, the image is going to explain exactly what she's trying to do here. But she's basically trying to describe the typical environment of every other person who might have an EV, and almost like outlining it as a challenge. Now, I would want this maybe to be almost like, again, I'm a big fan of journey maps, service blueprints, any type of blueprint of existing experiences. And it's probably one of the best ways to express what the day-to-day life looks like of a typical EV consumer, let's say, or customer or user. And so looking at it as a map would even help it even further, because you don't, again, depends on how you want to express this. This is article format. But as one of the assets which quickly can onboard someone, just spreading it out on Miro board or some sort of other methods which would allow me to quickly understand that ethnographic landscape, I guess, for lack of a better term, of what do that people actually deal with every day, would help out, especially in a linear approach, because I find myself at a lot of stakeholders, if it would be a typical UX project, if you list it out in a linear way from A to Z, it's much easier to guide them through the journey, even if the journey loops around, even if it's not really linear or it's not that static. It's much easier for people to understand what happens if you take the steps as a customer, as a user. So that's one way maybe to, I guess, improve this or double down and just add a bit of clarity to this. But ultimately, she also goes through describing the value of the actual charging at home and things of that nature. There is a lot of, I guess, small pivots here or guidelines, going from those issues, explaining exactly what those issues are, and then arriving at the how might we. So I like how this flows. One thing what I would want it to be, and what's something I noted down as one of the feedback bits as I was reading it the first time, was to maybe clearly separate the chapters here, or make it a bit more clear that, let's see, this is the challenge outline, this is the development, almost like a three big phases to the story, if that makes sense. If we take any of the, let's say, story development arcs or something like that, it just might be a bit easier to understand, or maybe adding a visual cue that, this is one chapter, this is a second chapter, a third chapter, might help out as well. So you don't lose the reader, let's say, or hiring manager's attention. Again, hiring managers are just going to scan through, and they are going to pick up on the key snippets, key headlines, so it has to be scannable and easy to interpret what's coming. So maybe something just to consider if you ought to use this as part of your case studies in the portfolio. Anyhow, I'm already showing what's next and waffling around the previous things. But how might we, and there's a couple of them, is the story. And I like the storyboards, because the storyboards, I guess, for the newcomers to the field or developing designers is one way to one, you could use it potentially to outline what experience is like today, but I would then be very specific and instead use experience map. But when it comes to the more visionary pieces of work or the future states of experience or something to come, nothing better onboard stakeholders than a visual representation or storyboards of sorts. And this outlines the journey of Jakub, who's considering to buy an electric vehicle because he discovered a subsidy scheme. Now, I would be questioning here, how did he discover that? Maybe that's the journey you could actually cover too. But he goes through all these steps, basically trying to contact a specific person who's, let's say, allowing them to charge a battery, things of that nature. So it walks through that future state of how Jakub, let's say, would go from A to Z. Again, the supportive bits and bobs here would be really beneficial, I feel like, because you can then add, those onboarding bits, the adoption bits. How are you going to spark the engagement? How ultimately Jakub would discover this, basically, or where would he research it? How would you find out? Maybe it's a content strategy piece where you tap into it and you engage it through some sort of means, a lot of things to consider. And if you add that, not necessarily in your storyboard, but maybe one of the things saying that this is needed to unlock this, maybe that would help out. Of course, she captures a lot of limitations of, let's say, parking infrastructure. Again, massive challenge, right? This is something we discovered in the previous case study yesterday, because if you tackle something on a service design level where it's a lot of parties involved, a lot of governing bodies, a lot of dependencies, like way too many even to name, but infrastructure for parking and infrastructure for roads is massive. Ultimately, you could also consider that another bad limitation from, I guess, sustainability approach is that if you still incentivize the people to get more wheels or more cars, you kind of incentivize more people to opt in for cars, because let's say if you have, 1,000 drivers right now and the remainder of the people don't really even consider getting a car, a lot of people are on the fence. They might choose public transport right now, which could be even greener, let's say, than 100,000 people opting in for EVs all of a sudden, and needing that energy. Like, where does that energy comes from, as described from Luisa before? So there's a lot of, I guess, balancing acts here, and we need to almost, like, as designers, researchers, not just understand about improvements to the experience, but also think if us incentivizing people to get that car actually gonna benefit, what we ultimately want to achieve here, right? Like, which is a good customer experience, but also at the lowest of the costs for the environment or just that customer themselves, because if their demand for energy is going to spike up, so will the costs, as we see right now in rising costs across the globe for energy, all in all. Anyhow, the hypothesis what she took on was that she believes that creating a community of sharing charge points and knowledge exchange can help people who don't have direct access to public charging stations to be more encouraged to buy electric vehicles. In addition, thanks to the government financial support, this community will be encouraged to purchase EVs even more. That's good enough. That's great hypotheses. She describes exactly how she could test it and how she could quantify it, through what exactly she could roll that out and things of that nature. And then the results of like what would actually that mean to the, you know, regular people, how much would it cost? And then she went into how might we sort of targeting the specific people and who would they be, describing them in the personas. One of the personas here would be targeting users who have lack of access in their residency, so someone who wouldn't have a charger. And another one is targeting people who are traveling and don't have control over charging points. So it's almost like a two specific segments, which I guess come from that anxiety of the charging points and availability of it. But there is, again, a lot of assumptions made here, as she notes down, and there is about the customer behavior in the market, the acceleration of buying new cars, and then how do you actually validate this hypothesis. And I feel like it's a good end. I feel like this is where the actual design projects would kick in, or the typical experience design or UX projects could kick in, because it's almost like it taking a lot of that market research and synthesizing it into the themes and then proposing to, you know, to basically what could be next. And it's the community development, some thinking about the engagement, who do you actually target, things of that nature. And so a typical UX designer could come in, take this insight, go find out deeper, take those personas, I guess, as a proto personas, engage with them, interview them, observe them, and build on top of that. One thing which is a risky thing here is making quite a few different assumptions, basing on the research which has already been done. But ultimately, I feel like this is a decent piece of research, and it's really good to see that, you know, that someone dedicated the time to go deeper as well and understand this. There is a few jumps, of course. But having said that, I truly enjoyed to go through this, and I'm sure you actually benefited. Someone who's on chat also benefited, or someone who's watching this. Hey Martina, I see we have a few people joining, a couple of discussions on the Eevees. Let's go to the next case study. And by the way, as I'm talking and waffling through this, make sure to add your notes as well, your thinking. Maybe you have challenging bits, be constructive to a person, but it surely benefits everyone when we go through this. And also it's a good, I guess, thought experiment too, what's right, what's wrong. Then you incentivize people to opt in, and you get even more drivers on the road ultimately. Cool. All right. So the next case study is work in progress as well, but I like a few bits here, and it's by Adam. And Adam described this, to give a few bits of context, as a learning experience. He basically made a start and a first draft of a few bits which he tried to, you know, see exactly what sticks, what doesn't stick. And I have a few different feedback bits to him. But ultimately, he started with defining the goal. And for this project, he researched the hindrances people had to the adoption of electric vehicles. Again, trying to understand exactly what would keep away the person. He outlined his project plan, which, again, this case study, or I guess this UX project, because it's in a draft format, I read it almost like a report. Almost, I tried to think about this as I'm one of Adam's teammates, let's say, or someone who would pick it up and carry it on. But ultimately, in a case study, I wouldn't recommend to, you know, to outline these, because these questions are great. This is exactly what you should be thinking as a UX designer. But for a hiring manager, of course, like, just show it basically what you did, and how does it link, or what questions, or what did you think you could tell it as a story ultimately. So just in case someone who's an entry-level designer sees, you know, a few different ways to present things, think about this as a, I guess, as a flow of the existing project, which is yet to develop, or, you know, it's a continuous report basically, while the other case studies might have been complete. and it's also might have been done for a different target audience. Either way, what I liked about this is that he explained exactly what he was trying to, I guess, think about, about the human centricity and thinking about usability, desirability, the three, I guess, cornerstones of a design thinking and meaningful innovation, thinking about tech limits, the business side, the user side, and then between the three parts, basically finding that sweet spot. His process and a process outline, which I personally appreciate when people summarize what's to come or summarize exactly end to end what would happen. But he's saying that he did some user research, information architecture, design, and then gathering insights and finishing up. So basically trying to validate it. His user research consisted of interviews, personas. Then information architecture went to user flow, sitemaps, card sorting, wireframing, prototyping, user testing, iterating. Typical design approach, right? And typical milestones and activities. Nothing raised here. My eyebrows basically. Apart from the card sorting, which came after the sitemap, I would probably, and again, you can use card sorting at any point. You could use it as part of your, let's say, interviews and make it a hybrid interview / card sorting, because you want to understand how your customers or users would look at different data units or information and kind of like how do they actually think, how do they actually position it, and how do they actually group those information units to form new blocks of information, for lack of a better term. But the card sorting to me immediately kind of was like, oh, why is it so late ultimately, or shouldn't it come a bit earlier, let's say? But again, depends what did you actually sort, of course, what sort of information. I'm, by the way, a big fan in the research efforts to combine as many things as possible. Again, you could do purely the behavioral qualitative interviews, let's say, but you could also have a section in it trying to sort something out, or following up in a different angle, trying to combine the methods just to make it much more cost effective. He started defining the hypothesis that people are hesitant to making a shift to EVs. And let me just zoom in. You might not see the detail. It's a PDF, but basically he tries to address the hesitation, and his hypothesis is that it's too expensive, which is, I think it's a no-brainer. And he's trying to think of how to convey, I guess, or surface the financial benefits of owning such vehicles in the long run. So he's thinking that, okay, if I take a customer and who's on a fence, if I showcase them, I guess, this is what it could result down the road, they're much more likely to change that attitude and opt in and develop new behaviors. But the key theme he went across is affordability. Again, this is a massive gem, by the way. I guess he maybe got it from my brief, which had some of those motives, but I would be interested to see exactly what he found out next. He researched the different problems people had with EVs, mostly through forums and Quora. Here I noted down that he could have added a few reference points or added more anecdotal evidence. Let's say if you would go on Quora and you don't really have an access to the users, give me what they're saying. You could illustrate it. You could make a cloud of quotes, whatever, just showing it, a bit enriching it, so it doesn't feel as dry. You could always kind of add to it a bit, or links do work, as you've seen in other case studies. People do add a few different bits here and there. And on Quora, from a user research perspective, on Quora, he basically, and in one-to-one, I guess, in-person interaction with a cab driver, he summarized this. Now, I would be very careful, by the way, adding the quant to limited samples of information. Again, I totally understand that you might not have a connection to people, or you might not have engaged with them, but just be very careful when your sample is limited, or it's by proxy, which I would say Quora is. If someone asked a question and you just research by keyword, you find their answers, but they're very distant, or they might lack context, they might lack deeper information. So I would be very careful adding numbers. Numbers do sell, by the way. So if you have evidence and you add, oh, I talked to 5 people, amazing, stakeholders might lose their minds, but it might not be right, or it might be quite misleading. So just be careful adding the numbers, let's say, or just saying that 5 quotes on affordability. Instead, you could create a word cloud again or something like that, just showing that affordability was the keyword which was mostly resonant, or people use it linguistically speaking in their language appeared that way. You could just be a bit more, I guess, transparent in that way, and that, it would, I guess, be less misleading in a way when you try to crunch, again, that limited sample of evidence. I hope that makes sense, by the way. If anyone in the chat has anything to add, do feel free to add your thoughts. But Adam took the segmentation, which was part of that Deloitte's research I presented in the brief, and he decided to go with the segment age, which basically is people who can, I guess, afford a bit more, as they're in 31 to 50 years old, they're much more financially stable. This leads that to choose that segment as a target audience, as they could be more inclined to make the shift to the electrical vehicles. Again, a few gems here, and I would advise Adam to look, deeper, or to enrich each step further. Don't finish off just here or jump immediately to design just yet. And just for everyone else's sake, Adam, because this is part of that in progress draft, he went through an information architecture. He created a sitemap to simply represent things, but he's being honest that this is, a start basically. So Adam, if you're watching this, make sure to pick this up and still go deeper based on the feedback, or try to, do a bit more research, try to still run those interviews. I couldn't access his prototype, by the way, but I'm sure he started to create something, but I wouldn't race it just yet. And for everyone else, if you're doing your projects, just on a general note, don't focus on time or arriving at some evidence too quick, because some things do require, especially in UX, to diverge and then converge in some sort of findings or outputs or outcomes in the end. It does take time. So invest the time until you know enough to proceed. Don't jump to conclusions too soon or assumptions, because the jumps here are quite sudden. So I would just challenge Adam to look, and continue on this. Anyhow, he took that segment, and I guess he used that Quora information to outline this. But it's, there's a lot of assumptions here. For example, things about them being married with kids, or, what they do, things of that nature. A lot of this thing could be quite assumptive or perceived in that, if this would be a case study. So again, linking it back into the research would matter a lot, and kind of outlining it in as realistic way as possible. So maybe there's almost like too much information in this persona if, you did have just one interview with a cab driver, which is probably not part of the user group, and then Quora items. Again, try to do more interviews basically to outline this. I like that he outlined this mindset, so you can easily understand that this person is future-oriented and environmentally conscious, and then frustration core needs, things of that nature, but they're quite high level. Again, I would challenge to go a bit deeper. And the hypothesis is proving to be correct, that affordability is the main issue people make to hesitate to change to EV. But again, based on that Quora findings he found out so far. So this is what you know so far. Try to understand if there are any gaps, or what else could you try to understand to take it into the solution, because affordability alone is almost like a core driver, right? Like everyone is scarcity averse, and everyone is scarcity driven, where the resources are one of the key important factors, psychologically speaking, to cover, to have enough of. If you take something like Maslow's pyramid of human needs, the basic resources would land down below and would have that massive fundamental band which you need to cover in order to then take yourself into step 2, step 3, and almost create that holistic pyramid where you get from this, the ultimate core needs up until much more self-actualization driven things. So maybe that's something you could also, Adam, explore and maybe define a bit much more from a psychological angle exactly what does that affordability mean to a person, instead of jumping quickly into the user flows or information architecture, sitemaps, things of that nature. Because another thing what he did is jump into the existing MG homepage of the vehicles. And again, the MG website is new to me, by the way, so I might misspeak here, but he tried to understand exactly how the persona would go through this. And then he created sitemap, or I guess evaluated the existing sitemap and then tried to redefine it. Now, I feel like this is jumping into that typical product design thinking and doing, and jumping way a bit too quick into it. I would challenge Adam again, after he's done with the interviews, look at the assist experience for the likes of Edward and how do they go about with their existing vehicles. Okay, this is a person on a fence who cares about affordability, that's clear. But tell me a bit more, like what do their day-to-day looks like? Like when he's considering the vehicle, or a typical scenario where he goes, let's say, on a Tesla website, how does it go through it? What considerations does he have? If he drops off, why? Like what sort of decision-making factors are there? Why does he drop off? If you can surface that, then you can take that information and say, oh, if I would redesign a website for MG, I can use that information. And then if a person like Edward comes to that MG, we can actually hook them in and maybe say, hey, if you opt in for Eevee, you can actually save in the future, if that makes sense. So you almost like retro engineer and backwards engineer that experience. But if that's the case, and if you just want to redesign a website of a customer offering, then you need to understand as is and what would Edward experience being on that fence between EVs and petrol vehicles and not being sure about that affordability. So that's something to think about. But it's a good take. It's very, very interesting take to these things. And again, a few challenges, a few tweaks, a few different bits to look into, and then you can arrive at a much stronger case study. Cool. Anyone else on a chat or on a live stream? Any other thoughts? Whilst I take a sip and a quick break. Something coming in. So Kevin is saying, the question I would ask is that an actionable hypothesis and how isolated it is from other factors that are context dependent. Affordability compared to what? Towards what intents? I agree with that. David, appreciate the Maslow's reference. Can you elaborate a bit more on it? Sure, we can maybe come back to the Maslow's thing after the last case study, because I feel like it's quite important. Maybe I can actually create a video as well on it, David, if you're interested that in terms of the context of UX approach and how could you use it as a UX designer ultimately. Love the feedback. Car leasing can be a good option to take it into account. That's definitely one of the things. I like your focus on the users. We all rush it. Cool. And I do agree with this because it's also, I think the theme I had in mind yesterday and something I highlighted was not just to rush into the solution, but also be able to diverge enough before you converge. And in this case specifically, not to, give too much feedback again and arrive at something which is not actionable. But let's say jumping from, your research about affordability, which is Kevin's point, let's say, that the hypothesis needs a bit more context, how to make it more actionable in terms of what. There's a few steps here which are like, massive jumps, basically. It's having that holistic view and then jumping too quick into and laser focusing on like a website of the competitors. So again, you need to diverge enough before you arrive at very specific bits. And a website, to me, feels in this case way down the line. Like if you want to see, if let's say you want to redesign a website immediately, then just go and redesign it. But you need to do enough research, enough exploration, enough understanding of what affordability means to the likes of Edwards, the persona, and only then arrive like down the road with all those means. Maybe it's an app, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a holistic omni-channel service of apps and websites, maybe it's a subscription service, maybe it's as someone in the chat like Gustavo just said, car leasing could be an option. No, there's a lot of different bits which you could surface on, which all touch affordability, but not jumping immediately into a website and saying, I'm going to redesign the likes of MG. It's one of the sensible things to do. And I think a lot of people actually going to resonate with that. Anyhow, let's jump into the next case study. And do let me know if you want me to cover any of the points. I know I'm trying to race too, being respectful of everyone's time, but do let me know if you want me to cover anything like the Maslow's pyramid of human needs. I might just pull up immediately, but let's finish with that. So do leave some stuff in the chat. Anyhow, so this case study, as you can see, is by Marshall, and Marshall wanted to, like, there is very little context. So Marshall just submitted this, and I tried to explore, understand exactly what this was about, what did he want to do. But ultimately, right off the bat, I'm going to give a few feedbacks. One is that it's nicely laid out, and you're going to see that, alongside this. So it's thought out, it's researched a bit, it's designed. There is a lot of, again, jumps, which are natural with this limited, I guess, time frame projects. But ultimately, there is a few bits here. And he's trying to an electrifying solution to increase Eevee adoption in the UK. So he's trying to also think about the copy, about the presentation. One of the things which immediately popped into my mind, if you're creating a conceptual case, if it's self-directed and you're creating a new brand, what I didn't see in this case study, and maybe I'm just jumping too ahead, but if you're creating a brand and it's a self-directed, let's say it's entrepreneurship effort to create an app or a service, is you also need to then add the rationale about the brand itself. It's such a small, I guess, part of customer experience design and old school user experience design. It doesn't get enough attention, but I feel like you as a user experience designer could elaborate on why did you choose to call it that? What's the tone of voice? What's the content strategy is like? What's the social media presence is like? And some bootcamps do cover a lot of that. So I see in like junior portfolios here and there that we consider the branding. But again, it's just from a UX perspective could benefit as well, just calling things, and why does it, let's say, is approachable brand, or why would someone who is on a fence could consider a brand like that, let's say, or, even color choice, things of that nature. Not that we ever dive too much into visual or UI design, but I feel like it could be beneficial explaining it. Anyhow, so the case study is nicely laid out, right? But the challenge, and it took 4 weeks, by the way, some tools, the role that he was a generalist, so I guess researcher and designer, but the challenge was to help increase adoption in the UK by making the service of more affordable EVs. And he summarizes that he wanted to use people-centered design methods. The problem area, again, I like the simplicity of this because he's talking about, I guess, 3 big factors, which is affordability, range anxiety, charging issues. So creating this, I guess, triad of things of what exactly, and also visually showcasing it. So it's very clear immediately what he's after. But with this, with everything you do like that, let's say if you're stating that affordability is key, tell me exactly where did you find it? Like references always help, because then it's not just a hunch. Even if, let's say, maybe it's not from a user research, which you did, yourself as an individual contributor, let's say, maybe it's a market research, you could actually quote it and say that this is where I found it from, and then add that to that. So just evidencing everything you say, so it doesn't appear just like an opinion. And I'm giving this feedback in a lot of case studies, right? But I think in this in particular, because this looks very finished, right? Like it looks like a case study, or a case study I would see in, let's say, a portfolio as a hiring manager, but then I would want evidence. So I know, where does this notion come from? Is it just a hunch, or is it a factual thing? If it's a factual thing, add a factual thing, because again, there's a lot of material online, I know already, but someone might not. So, we might discount your statements. So just avoid that. Anyway, so when he went into hypotheses and saying that he hypothesized that if he creates a company that provides products and services for UK drivers aged 31 to 50, exactly the same group as previous case study, it will increase EV adoption by 30% within the next 3 years. And this is very, very bold statement from a variety of perspective. One is the hypothesis that if he creates a company, and I'm ignoring provides products and services, but it's almost like it's too vague and too broad of a hypothesis statement. I would be much more specific here, because it is about the product's perspective, right? So if you would, let's say, paraphrase this and say, if, I don't know, if he would to create, and I'm going to read my notes, by the way, so I might also misspell here. But if he were to create an inclusive service that allows to compare the vehicles, or create some sort of membership of charging ports, again, going back to almost like that first case study about that community, then, drivers age 31 to 50 could increase the adoption by 30%. So this needs a bit more specificity, because otherwise it could mean a lot of different things. You could also add sub-hypotheses down the road, basically describing what those, feature buckets look like, or not even feature buckets, but opportunity buckets look like. Creating a company which is going to provide the service of EVs is not really opportunity, it's an action, right? So what is that opportunity like? What value is it going to deliver to the drivers that they would choose it, basically? And long story short, another thing which kind of was very questionable was that 30%. Specificity is key with every hypothesis, right? Because then you can actually prove it, challenge it down the road if you research. Adoption by 30% sounds very bold. And it's, you might then want to, if you have that unit, quote it somehow, what's the control here, let's say. If you would have an existing, I don't know, a product or service, and you know that your conversion rates are like, let's say 3%, which would be golden, everybody would die for it. Then you can say I would improve based on that, but you need to add that context, basically. Otherwise, it's very, very bold and lacks almost measures. I would be immediately questioning, is this fictitious? Is it real? Where does this number come from? What are you trying to add to, that type of stuff? And I hope this makes sense to other people as well. Do let me know your thoughts on the chat too. But I feel like for Marshall, this is almost like immediately he could improve it if he would add, he tries to be a bit pragmatic here and tries to tie in a few loose ends here and there. And what I like in this hypothesis too is that he lists how he would measure this. And I feel like continuous surveys, focus groups, and things of that nature is one of the things, right? But it's also then again needs to fall back to that specific measure and has to kind of build on top of that. And I know this is, by the way, another thing. Sorry, and I want to do justice to Marshall too, but one of the feedback bits I wanted to summarize here, because next he goes into the solution and he outlines the solution of different products and what they entail, what's the services like, a bit of the app screens too, and then jumps into the actual approach. Whilst this is laid out really nicely, a feedback for Marshall would be to clearly again separate the chapters. when I was kind of going through this first time, and now I caught myself too, was that I thought that this is leading me on a story through the project, as in it already tells me a story, but this was just a summary. And then like I was kind of like dumbfounded when I realized, oh, he actually goes a bit deeper into that. So showcasing maybe clearly that I'm still in the solution outline or a summary or the intro state or step would help out. So maybe you can add some visual cues here, or maybe just outline in a, you know, like at first a slide, an intro slide of what's to come. But it would aid the storytelling. It would aid the actual reading experience for me as, let's say, hiring manager, or just an, you know, random reader online who found your case study ultimately. But anyhow, so the solution, spoiler alert for everyone, because there is more to come, is, I guess, partnership between UK government and BYD, Build Your Dreams. I didn't know what BYD stood for, by the way, reading at this. I had to go and Google. So I feel like, again, backing up things or adding links or visual cues or explanation, what is Build Your Dreams, which is, I think it's Asian manufacturer of vehicles. Just FYI for everyone who, you know, you might know about it, you might not, but that's that. He also was thinking about backpack or flow on backpack, which I guess is their offering of DC charging for long distance trips. Then the services of subscription payments, electrifier charging service, which is basically people who will come to your location and charge your EVs. So there's a lot here, right? Like this is not a startup. This is a lot to cover for a startup or newly created company, by the way. So that's another thing. But again, it's self-directed. I like that he's looking way ahead, or is very, I guess, future thinking, or you know, he's looking about like that future vision in a way, but also that ideal state instead of limiting himself. But what he did, which kind of, I guess, a bit threw me off, was define that app screens, or what value would the users get from using the app itself, which is basically easy access to your EV needs, manage your important EV information, bringing the charge to you, things of that nature. So it still went into the app, whilst I would want to know a bit more, and maybe it's just me from my perspective, but as a more senior designer, I would want it to be like explanatory of what the others would mean, because these are essential scaffold for any service. It's not just the app, it's what's going to go into the app. And he knows it because he literally wrote it down that this is what's going to be needed. So maybe, again, maybe down the line, and I know that he didn't include it, but a service blueprint would work amazing here. And I'm sure a few people, maybe Kevin, if he's still on a chat from the service design perspective and thinking, would benefit, you know, understanding how that app looks like in terms of all those different products and service lines and supportive units. Like, what does that portfolio of touch points look like for the users, and what you as a company or you as a business, I don't know, product manager or stakeholder would need to account for. What do you actually need to do to make this happen ultimately? Anyhow, jumping into the detail or his approach, and this is where I would want to break a bit and say, you know, this is my approach to this. He did some of the market research and he links it. And this is what I kind of missed in the beginning, but he goes down and actually lists it out. So maybe it's a way to restructure the story, or restructure how you lay out case study, or clearly state that this is a summary and do it much more linear and then go into the depth explaining it. He created a driver persona. Again, the step from one to the other is not really clear. The segmentation could have been done here. Justin Forty, SMB owner who owns petrol vehicle, as far as I understood. I like the simplicity again of a persona, but it's one of the people in that range of 31 to 50-year-old. Is it representative of all of them? Maybe, but I would kind of almost challenge you to think again from something I mentioned in the previous stream yesterday, was persona grids. So Justin is still on a life cycle, right? Like from very disinterested or someone who would never consider the EV up until he's a buyer and an owner of EV. Where between those 2 points does Justin land. And what are the other, I guess, slots between those two, like, milestone points? Because I could bet that Justin today and Justin tomorrow could look very different, and maybe they're just almost like a step towards a buyer or owner of a Eevee. Maybe this is those segments you could outline and say that from a persona grid perspective, behavioral speaking, you could nudge and push Justin from his today spot to that tomorrow spot. And again, maybe do let me know in the chat, by the way, if you want me to maybe do a video explaining. I did a lot of persona grids back in the day, trying to kind of get my clients to buy in the change and what they need to focus on, trying to tell them that this is who they are targeting now and this is who their user is. But if they do these extra bits, they could actually push the user and have them better or have them as a paying customer. If you want me to cover this, smash something and do let me know in the chat. Otherwise, I'll take silence as a no. So let me jump through. But anyhow, I feel like going back to Marshall's case, again, this the jump is again, this is one user, right? But a bit more context could kind of make sense, or how would you nudge it to next state? I like that he included that anecdotal evidence. Again, it's a cheap point, right? But adding a bit of a photo of a post-it notes shows a bit of a progress, especially if there are other people and it's like, oh, 10 extra points. And of course, I'm half joking, but you get my point. You kind of can illustrate a bit of your approach, and that adds a bit more warmth than, let's say, the Miro board, post-it notes, which look like they're done in the isolation. And I see a bit of positive sentiment saying that, yes, please, they would be interesting video. Okay, I'm going to put that on my list as a to-do, and I might explore that in the future, which could be yet another tool which might benefit everyone, basically. But anyhow, he goes through Eevee adoption issues from Justin's perspective. He made a journey map focusing on Justin's journey and purchasing of an electric vehicle. This is something I have a lot of things to say. I like the approach of it, but this focuses on Justin as a person purchasing the vehicle, right? But it doesn't focus on Justin as a person who's on a fence and considering it, because it's not just about them, I guess. How to explain this easily, but it's not just about them going on a website and clicking a button. There is a life behind it, right? Like their experience is to be designed end-to-end and very holistically first. They're not just a buyer, they're actually human being, and kind of outlining the experience of them buying an EV presumes that Justin is a constant buyer of EVs, if that makes sense. If you're just to outline how they would go about that persona to buy that vehicle, you almost are stating that they're just every week buy a new EV, which doesn't really make sense. So Justin is a person who doesn't even have an EV yet. Show me what their experience is like today before they buy that EV. Because this is almost like a combination of as-is experience and to-be experience, which is not really a good way to do that. Show me the as-is very clearly, and then ideate and tell me what should be a to-be based on that evidence, on those pain points and opportunities. And I hope that makes sense to a lot of growing designers, and something I see in a lot of portfolios, which kind of ability to separate the as-is experience and looking at it very holistically, not just from them using your product, and also them using your product in the future is going to aid you a lot if you can actually show the two and the difference and how you transition from one to the other. So I would just go about and outline the Justin's daily struggles with petrol vehicles. If you are truly targeting those things you described, affordability, range, and charging, show me what Justin's day-to-day look like right now. He surely has a petrol vehicle, and he surely, I think he does like 300 kilometers every week. That's a lot of mileage. I mean, to some it's going to be average, to some it's going to be little, to some it's going to be extensive, but he surely fills in the tank every single, I don't know, a few days, right? Like if it's 300 kilometers, so okay, he might have filled up the tank twice a week, maybe once a week, depends on the motor and his, size of the engine, right? How does that would look like as compared to the Eevee? If you would kind of make a case that, well, if he only fills in twice a week, and you know that factually, this is where is experience, that to be experience could look very similar, and maybe this is that nudge that Justin needs to know about. Because if he would do the same journeys, same kilometers, things of that nature, and he would only charge up their vehicle twice a week, just like he does with the petrol, then you match those two things together, you almost solve it for them. It's a no-brainer for Justin to buy an Eevee. And I know this is high level, but it should make sense as well, because then you can shape the content strategy, how you engage with Justin and what you tell them, the messaging on a website or app you're going to design. You're going to be like, hey, Justin, did you know? If you spend 300 kilometers a week every week traveling, you can get exactly the same experience from the Eevee, because you're gonna need to charge them as much as stopping at the charge station and filling in the gas. Of course, there is time frame to recharge and things of that nature, but you can shape your products and services to tell that story to the user or customer, and then kind of cover their hesitation points and nudge them just slightly into the new ways of doing things or new behaviors ultimately. And I hope that makes sense. So Rita is saying, I like this recommendation to make sure to describe your current experience versus the new one. And it's, to be honest, it's not just a recommendation. Like as a UX designer, you need to deeply understand as is experience before you design the new experience. Otherwise, it becomes a risky business and it becomes almost like a guesswork. And it's not what, we as UX designers should be proud of, kind of like a jumping to conclusions too soon. It's something what you, I guess, learn throughout the years of hammering and facing challenge and eating a crap load of crap in UX to understand that like a quick, like immediate, jumps into solutions is really bad for you as a UXer, your team, your customers, your users. It's not gonna kind of, let's be more reactive, but more proactive for research and understanding. Again, you don't have to do all the research in the world, but pausing and telling your stakeholder, well, it depends, but we need to now go and take this hypothesis and do the research. It's very, very important. Anyhow, so let's continue here. But after working with the beginning of a design process, he began to brainstorm and ideate on other people and EV adoptions of their market, what type of range of EV companies, the idea of, what charging could be. And he dived back into the discovery stage and tried to taking three trips of the iteration road. So I guess he ran 3 different ideations. One was about the subscription payment model. Another one about exploring the EV market in China, which I guess that BYD and where it came from. And the last one is drone-based charging solutions. And this is where it's a bit tricky for me to understand, I guess, because it's almost like a 3 phases, but it's 3 outcomes from the ideation. And in my head, I kind of understood that he did the crazy 8s first and then arrived at drones, at exploring the EV market, and then subscription payment model. Or perhaps it's the other way where he was more specific in it, but it's very unclear in this way. So maybe he could kind of tie in. And Marshall, maybe a few feedback bits for you is really to think of how this flows and if it's clear. There is a big jump, by the way, between your user items and then ideations. So I would probably, I guess, this how other companies are tackling EV adoption markets. It's not really ideation point, it's more of a competitive analysis. Maybe you can clearly state that. And then also taking the specific pain points, ideate on how much could you solve that. Use those opportunities you outline to solve them. And then, these brainstorming bits might be answered by that. Maybe you did that, but just making it a bit more clear so it flows nicer would be quite beneficial. Anyhow, another bit what I would want to tell here is that these three themes or these three bandings are super specific. One way to present this could have been like a sun-ray diagram, let's say, and maybe it's a learning point for a lot of UXers. But again, just like I described the ideation method yesterday on the other stream, that let's start with a very far future, knowing what you know. Let's say, what would the service or product would look like in the next 5 to 10 years? Then walk backwards, defining it. What would the ideal solution look like, or what could you achieve in the next year or two? And then define that MVP, let's say, or whatever you call it, MAP. There's a lot of definitions now, but that minimal first step, what is that slice of product which you're going to deliver so it unlocks the value to the user immediately, and you can prove or disprove that there's traction in the market. Drone-based deliveries or charging solutions, here would be quite down the road. But if you can show me visually what's the starting point and end point, and just in one slide, you could just summarize so much. You could tell the story in one slide. You don't have to go bit by bit, because otherwise it seems very drastical, like jumping into subscription model or drone-based is like, it's telling, oh, this is who the users are, this is their challenges, and then bam, drones. Bam, payment model. It's like, how does that connect? Tell me. That's a missing bit. So just consider that. And then ideation he did with Crazy Eights, that's one of the methods, and he decided to create a flow went app. And again, it jumping from, free bands, like crazy stuff, and then saying, oh, I'm gonna make an app. So there is a bit of a disruption point here. It's up to you how you tell that story, but you better be able to tell how the jump happened and why you jumped from one thing to the other. But he prototyped the app itself. So he did some low fidelity wireframes. I'm not going to go too much into it. I hope he shares the link with you. Again, it's his decision if he wants to share with it. He went to mid fidelity mockups, and then created an interactive prototype, basically, of going how the users would actually interact with the thing and have their apps, with, let's say, supporting their Eevee. And I understood this, by the way, that these things like the free band subscription payment model, exploring the Eevee market, and drone-based would support this on a service level, but it's not too clear. Just jumping through those ideation segments was a bit tricky to navigate. Let's see what the chat says. I can see how much this case study would benefit from good branding. The visual outlook in this case study is great. I don't think the branding itself is bad. But my point of the branding in the beginning was to explain exactly why you think this branding would resonate with your users. Again, everything you do has to link with some evidence and some, user research, basically. That was the only point. For this challenge, I would recommend to check the transport decarbonization plan. It has a lot of valuable information. It is important to know what the government plans or to include it with the user research. And I agree, Gustavo. This is almost that point where who was earlier in the chat, Luisa was highlighting that, hey, adoption of the EVs is just treating a symptom. Perhaps there is a bigger developments which need support. Could be infrastructure, could be development of public transport, and I bet that public transport probably is greener, even if it's petrol-based, than, let's say, an individual EV vehicles. Again, calculated guess from what I've seen or what I read up online. Maybe it's totally untrue, depends on maybe region as well, or petrol types, or a lot of different factors, how busy the roads are, metropolitan areas versus rural areas. But ultimately carrying on more capacity tends to, and having worked with transport, that's my assumption or presumption, let's just put it that way. But the government, when they come up with these bans, nothing happens in isolation. So I kind of just echo Gustavo's point that you can always and should always look into it exactly why that's happening or what's the supportive elements of that. Because again, banning the petrol vehicles or incentivizing the EVs is just one way. It's just a solution, basically. How did they come to that, or what the program end-to-end looks like, is something you could look into as everyone, basically. It's a call out for everyone. Would it be okay if we who didn't submit our case study yet to continue? Of course, that's the whole point of these case studies. And I wanted to actually finish off reviewing this to call out and say that it doesn't matter when you find this, when you watch this. It could be that you find this 2 years from now. You can take this on. It's still going to be relevant. It's still going to be needed and necessary, and it's still going to be lifelike and require enough research, enough ideations, enough solutioning. So definitely continue. I mean, you don't have to limit the timeframes too. I put it 6-week arbitrary timeframe because Parkinson's law, you're going to spend as much time as you give that task to be done, right? So yeah, if you feel like you have a few weeks or a few months, go deeper. Like, make this a proper case study, because again, this is that thing which maybe keeps you from getting that UX job, because you feel like you have that mental blocker, which is internal. Well, you feel like, oh, I don't have enough experience to get that experience, which is 1 to 3 years, let's say, for junior roles right now, right? Well, what you can do with that, you can take this challenge and make that case study and show that you're capable to do the job. And hiring managers not gonna care because, I reviewed a lot of case studies from junior and entry-level designers, and that number is arbitrary too. It's what's in the portfolio, because if you spend enough time trying out different methods, trying out different tools, learning how to do UX, how to do research, what works, what doesn't work, all those insights out, you are going to be capable to do the job. And that's what ultimately matters. You need to have a case study or 2 or 3 in your portfolio. This is it. Take this challenge, make that case study, and that's going to count as professional experience. This is exactly why these challenges exist on this channel. Anyhow, last bit. Let me see if I can pull up Maslow's pyramid of human needs. Or hierarchy of needs, sorry. And that was, I think, David wanted to understand that. Which I wanted to highlight really just about, let's take maybe this visual thing. And let me know if you can still see it. Let's see if Google is cooperative with us. Cool. So this is big enough a thing for everyone to see. But what I was trying to tell is that if you target things like affordability, which is really resources-based need, you want things to be affordable because you want to have enough resources, you want to do something, you want to live good enough, basically, so you don't have a fear of scarcity or resources running out. This is a basic, I guess, physiological need, which is that last band at the bottom, basically. Air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, things of that nature. And I would even count here in between somewhere like the resources, which is a second band. I would even put that affordability, or being able to have enough money or enough resources to sustain yourself, your family, your needs, somewhere in between. So if you are discussing about your user needs and what they're going through every day, and that they truly care about affordability, and you need that evidence that this is a good idea to double down on it, and for sure from talking to people that this is what matters to them from a behavior perspective, you can quote Maslow's hierarchy of needs easily, because this is almost that fundamental basic band that they need to sustain it. And a lot of people from research, from what they encountered in that community case study, from Zoe today and other case studies, noted that down. that people are almost like afraid to opt in for new emerging tech because they don't know if it's going to compromise their livelihood, if their day-to-day is going to look like any different, if they're going to be able to pay their bills ultimately. Because if they can only afford $300 extra a month on a vehicles, they need to know that this is going to be enough. So it's deeply psychological decision making. Their attitude, therefore, is going to depend massively, and they're going to be very skeptical of new and edgy and maybe unreliable products and services out there. So something you could even say, hey, based on this, and again, depends who you communicate it with, right? Maybe in a portfolio, you could just write it down and say a statement that, that is based on that. You don't have to put this pyramid there. But as you communicate to stakeholders, you could pull it up and say, this is because of that. Or you could quote it out, or you could kind of say that this is deeply rooted to who we are as people. And that, let's say, if you know that your customers between arbitrary again, but if you want to target someone who's a millennial and they're under 31 years old and they don't have stable finances, you need to ensure that your messaging, your product, your services are going to support that, because otherwise they're not going to opt in. Or if they're going to opt in because they made a mistake that way, they're not going to engage and be a loyal customer, because eventually their funding is going to run out, and psychologically, or let's say safety needs or physiological needs are going to be compromised, and then they might drop off. So everything we do is deeply psychological. It's just how deep do you go, and how deep do you research, and how deeply ingrained your decisions are made, basically. I hope that makes sense. Ultimately, everything else here kind of follows that. If you as a human being cover your psychological needs, safety needs, if you feel loved, if you belong to something like a community, again, tapping into the Zoe's case study, the first one today, then you can focus on the esteem, then you can focus on self-actualization. So this pyramid basically builds you up as a person. And let's say, if and perfect example of that is developing world, let's say, where people don't even have the safety needs matched. Then things like love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization is not something they could even think about. You couldn't introduce Eevee vehicles there because you need to first, cover their safety needs, psychological needs. So maybe Eevee vehicles, it's not a solution there at all. Maybe it's something else altogether which would cover that. And I don't know, I don't even want to say what it is, because every case needs enough research and enough humane design to be good, to be empathetic. And if I would just give you a general theme, that it would just be general theme, and I would misspeak on so many different contexts and so many different environments. But I hope that makes sense. Last comment from Gustavo. If anyone else has anything to add on the chat, feel free to do that, because again, it definitely helps everyone else to understand where we're at, what we're dealing with. How many pages do you think a portfolio needs to have per project? There's valuable info in the case studies, but obviously we don't want to overwhelm recruiters. Yes. Short answer, the case study, just like a book, just like an article, just like a video, should be as long as it needs to be. As long as your storytelling is solid and sound, and you can keep people engaging, they could read, again, pages of material. Now, realistically speaking, having said that, a lot of hiring managers are not going to have any time, because hiring manager is not a title you are hired for as a design leader in a company. It's just a hat you're wearing. Let's say myself as a design manager, as a UX manager, where I manage 20 people, and I also need to hire people. I have to also, let's say, get contractors in. That is very small part of my job, but it takes a lot of time in a way. Small in a way where I can't focus too much, but it takes so much time because I have to go through so many interviews, review so many portfolios alongside everything else I would do, let's say, to support my team and the domains and the projects and things of that nature. In that case, you can imagine that the shorter it is, the better. But it also depends on, let's say, your seniority. Everything I reviewed today or let's say yesterday are just fine. It's just that you need to consider that as a hiring manager, I'm going to scan through and maybe come back to things which don't make sense or the things which glow, note them down to see exactly that you know, what you are doing. There is a good cohesive journey from the challenge to the solution. And then a lot of that contextual bit is going to be kind of discussed during the interview itself. Again, it depends. It highly depends, but I wouldn't stress too much. As long as you pull out the right information at the right times, UX your case study, showcase the things which you want your hiring managers to see potentially, and that's that really. So you do need to design how you present it. You do need to tell a good story. Maybe a video is the best way to do that. For example, myself, that's much easier to communicate than written format. But even then, sometimes you need to write enough because there could be so much research. If you're a researcher, by the way, a lot of researchers don't even have portfolios. Those who do, it could be, again, written format like what we've seen with Zoe's. That's quite typical to see from researcher perspective. They don't even go into design assets, let's say, and that would be enough for her to land a job as a researcher, let's say. That's my take, at least. Of course, a lot of people would disagree, but I would see her as a good fit in one of the teams I would manage, let's say, at different seniorities, of course, appropriate to the challenge. And David appreciated, have heard of Maslow's point, but wasn't fully sure how to incorporate it into essentially defending designs. Don't overthink it too. This has to flow naturally. If you're just going to start pulling charts, people might get thrown off because it might seem a bit too pretentious, arrogant, things of that nature. So you need to be, gradually putting in. A lot of people know about this already. So if you just mention Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that could be enough, basically. But just know and craft your message in the right way so it's perceived in the right and positive note. Anyhow, I feel like we are done, and it's been a blast. This challenge has been amazing. And again, thank you so much to everyone from the bottom of my heart. I really mean it. Thank you so much for everyone who spent this time. To me, the proudest point is when people actually arrive at these amazing case studies, because we can immediately use this to apply for jobs. This is almost like the tool you can use to immediately say, this is what I did based on the challenge. And you didn't have to wait to join a team. Of course, that would have helped if you would just join other designers or developers or product managers, because you can then say that it was collaborative effort. It adds extra points, which matters for real life-like projects. But having said that, you have some evidence, you display your thinking, you're doing all the different examples of how you would solve a problem. So to me, that's super important, and I'm super, super happy. And thanks so much for everyone who joined as well these live streams. Yeah, we overran quite a bit, but if you do have any questions, leave them down below. This is going to be available as a video after we're done with the live stream. And at some point in the next few weeks, maybe a month, there's going to be a new challenge. But having said that, if you want to get challenged, if you want to produce something, just take that brief and run with it. Don't limit yourself, don't constrain yourself. Just do some amazing UX work, capture it all, document it, and arrive at some evidence. But anyways, have an awesome weekend, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. And on that note, I'll see you next time.